All right. Welcome to the webinar about 7 ways to go wrong with engineering metrics. My name is Otto Hilska. I'm founder and CEO at Swarmia, and this just happens to be one of my favorite topics. Let me share my screen so we can get started with the presentation. Feel free to add any questions using the Q&A functionality of Zoom, and we'll be going through some questions at the end. For a quick intro of myself, I've been building software for a long time, started my first software company at the age of 18, then started a company called FlowDoc, which was a team collaboration tool, very similar to Slack. Learned a lot about kind of building a SaaS product. We got acquired by Rally Software, and I spent a few years there, and most recently spent 4 years at Smartly.io, building the product development organization as we went from 30 to 350 people. And based on those experiences, I started to look into this developer productivity space because at Smartly, we built these modern self-organizing product teams and realized that they actually do need some pretty good infrastructure and support for them to be continuously able to identify the bottlenecks as they emerge. And that is what we started building with Swarmia as well. So we're helping software development organizations continuously get better. We work with organizations like Outreach, Blinkist, and Volt, and we helped teams identify issues with their focus, with their process, things like kind of bottlenecks with cycle time, automated testing, etc. So that's part of the reason why we're talking about this, because we're seeing many organizations becoming more and more interested in this topic. And at the same time, I see that there's many ways to go wrong. So let's think about why engineering metrics were not a thing 5 years ago. And the answer really is that the approach was usually pretty bad, and you could do more harm than good by implementing development productivity metrics in a counterproductive way. So that's why today we wanted to talk about some of the anti-patterns we've seen around and some ways to get around them. The first thing that comes to mind for many people when we start talking about development productivity is, let me get this one number and put it next to each of my developers' names, and then somehow stack rank them so that I can tell who is my best developer and who is my worst developer. And even though this kind of performance management piece is obviously one part of the management's job, at the same time, it is the one area where you can kind of ruin the whole continuous improvement angle, because once you come up with a metric, whatever it is, and start ranking developers based on it, they will reject any tools that you're going to bring, any improvements you're trying to drive, because it seems so dangerous and toxic. So even though there might be some use cases for this occasionally, it is very unlikely that stack ranking developers would be your best bet in terms of starting. And developers are pretty good at identifying kind of how is this number actually calculated? Does it actually describe the job I'm doing? And for example, if you tried to calculate how many commits per day your developers are doing, just putting that number there, suggesting that this is kind of how well someone's doing, is going to get some manager. Developers understand that it's basically a personal preference how you want to split your work. So you definitely shouldn't be relying on something like this. The other common idea people get when thinking about this is thinking that there must be this one aggregate metric that's going to tell me how I'm doing. And aggregates can be useful for a couple of different use cases. It can be useful for identifying trends in the long term, and maybe for doing some sort of a sanity check, like are we within some healthy range for this particular metric. But overall, just looking at aggregate numbers is likely not going to get you very far, because it is an aggregate number that's changing pretty slowly. So whatever improvements you're driving, they are unlikely to have an immediate effect when you look at things like how often are we deploying as an organization or anything like that. So you have to look beyond just these numbers to be able to make any meaningful conclusions and actually have a good discussion about it. Another common problem is that it's thought to be something that's purely the responsibility of leadership. So, of course, leadership tends to be the part of the organization that's often interested in driving improvement, and that's natural. But it's not possible to do something like this without getting all of your engineers on board. And by implementing some of the kind of anti-patterns that we talked earlier, like the stack roll, you generally want to build these modern self-organizing product teams and get them to solve their own problems. And even though that's kind of an ideal state and not always realistic as the first step, still you have to think about the whole organization from the get-go as you're thinking of your strategy, how to keep improving developer productivity. Another common problem is to only look at one category of metrics. So usually it's pretty easy to get numbers from, let's say, Jira or whatever issue tracker you're using. And that will give you one type of metrics around the flow of work, how we're completing that, etc. But it's good to understand that it's always some sort of balance to figure out how to invest in the short term and long term, in the speed of development, in quality, all of these things. So you always have to try to find a balance with it. And for example, the scientific research that exists out there actually supports this idea of trying to find a balance. So the book Accelerate and the concept DORA metrics introduced in that book is one of the more popular papers out there. DORA metrics are lead time for change. So how long does it take for us to get code to production? Deployment frequency. So how often are we getting stuff out? Change failure rate. So how often does one of those changes then fail? And mean time to recovery, meaning that once it fails, how long does it take for us to fix it? And you can see that there's actually two dimensions here. So the first two are about maximizing our ability to ship continuously to production. And the latter two are about kind of the potential problems caused by shipping too fast. So if we're breaking the production environment, if we're causing a lot of exceptions, etc., these types of issues. And it is really about balancing those two. The same authors, or some of the same authors from that research, have worked on something called the space framework, which is a bit newer paper just from last year. And it talks about this kind of, first of all, looking at this at different levels, at the individual, team, and organizational level, but then looking at it in these different dimensions of satisfaction and well-being, performance or outcomes, activity, communication, efficiency, and flow. And it's basically kind of just a very simple idea to try to find a balance between these different metrics. And it even talks about you having to kind of create this for yourself. So it's not necessarily just one or two like specific areas that you would look into. So it looks like the scientific research is actually leading us to a good direction here. And that is pretty much kind of the common sense approach that we're seeing many organizations doing already, even if they're not calling it space framework or DORA metrics or anything like that. Another thing is that oftentimes we might be attracted to measuring something that is easy to measure. something that we can pull from some kind of a system, and then we just put the number out there. It's good to understand that the goal of measuring software development productivity is to help us get better and solve any problems that we have. And some metrics are actually counterproductive to this. So there's, for example, this category of Git analytics tools that are pulling data from your source code and the changes. And they might show you metrics like code churn, which is around kind of when a developer edits code, do they go back to editing this code right afterwards? And that kind of metrics are not shown to have any correlation with how well the organization is doing. And in fact, by looking at this kind of numbers, you might actually prevent some perfectly healthy behavior from happening, because developers will think that it's a bad idea to refactor the code that I just wrote, even though that might be just the right thing to do. So even if something's possible to measure, you don't necessarily have to measure it if you don't have an idea of how to use that to get better. From the agile world, one of the most common metrics used to be something called sprint velocity. So basically estimating story points and then looking at how well are we doing against what we planned for this sprint. And it's a little bit misleading because it's called velocity, but it really doesn't have a lot to do with the concept of velocity as we understand it from elsewhere. And the thing is that the team decides themselves how they want to estimate this work, and then you're kind of just following how that's going. So first of all, it's not comparable between teams in any way. It might be a helpful tool for improving your kind of sprint planning and understanding how much work to include there. I think most healthy teams don't necessarily even need that. So you can kind of get away from even estimating at all if you're able to just continuously ship and you have a good understanding of your team's capacity. But ultimately, it's a measure of predictability. So did we do what we said we would do? And being obsessed with something like this is not necessarily very, very good, because most teams would benefit from addressing the bottlenecks of what's slowing us down, how to move faster, how to make sure that we work on the right things, how to make sure that we're working in a balanced way, rather than optimizing for predictability. If you think about the kind of hierarchy of like how mature a team needs to be for them to be really predictable, you need to have a lot of things in order before you're actually able to get to that very predictable level. And even then, if you have a good historical understanding of how quickly the team is usually shipping, that might be all the predictability you need. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time kind of trying to micromanage the work in sprints and trying to improve predictability that way. And the final anti-pattern is taking someone else's opinions too literally. So it's good to know that it's your responsibility to build the best possible product development organization. And when you're when you're reading this research or kind of attending these webinars, we're all sharing some kind of a point of view that then you just need to incorporate into how you want to work. Because this is not some kind of a competition of who adopts the most measures or who has, like, this is not a maturity model where you should try to get everything checked so that you can do well. Because if you're an early stage startup, most likely your optimal process is something really lightweight, and people will just operate based on the context that they've accumulated themselves. And then if you are in another environment where breaking the production system would be really a big deal, then you have to prioritize different things. And basically you can just build your own process based on these learnings, but it is a good idea to have certain things in your toolbox, and that's why we're talking about these topics and trying to give you an idea of which papers to read and what metrics to think about when you're building your own system. So that's a bunch of anti-patterns. What should you really do then instead of that? The first thing is to understand that this is a cultural thing. Continuous improvement needs to be kind of understood by the whole organization. Oftentimes, when you talk with developers about developer productivity, they might get a bit scared, like, what is this about? Are you trying to make us code faster? And it's good to understand that that's not it. We want, first of all, it is good to clarify that for a business, it is actually really important how quickly we're able to ship the right products to our customers. But at the same time, it is indeed not about getting developers to code faster or any kind of micro optimizations. So, but if you think about the companies that are winning in the market right now, they tend to be ones that are actually good at building these products. So it really does make sense to invest in that. And you just need to have kind of the trusting environment where people are able to have these conversations without being afraid this data is going to be used against me in some way. And that's why it's also good to talk about these things proactively rather than just buying a tool and saying that, okay, here it is. It's good to talk about why are we driving this improvement and how can we and like also understanding some constraints, how we're not going to be using this data. Another thing that's actually the real deal is cycle time, work in progress, basically all the stuff from the lean management and lean software development circles. So that, like, the stuff that we talk about in some of these agile processes, it is actually backed by some proper research, and it is actually good to think about how to split your work, how to limit work in progress and that kind of things, because it will actually help you. There's a number of reasons why many organizations, as they grow, they are drawn to, for example, trying to do too much at the same time. It's just in our human nature that when you're being really successful and there's going to be more and more people asking for something from the development team, we like to please them and we like to say that, yes, of course, we would be happy to look at that. But at some point, there's just too much work. And then you realize that we're actually not getting anything done because we're just jumping between different priorities, all of which are urgent. And as a result, we've shipped 80% of this feature and 90% of this feature and 50% of this feature. And yet we're not actually getting any of those out to the customers. And in fact, most likely your customers would be happier if you just shipped one thing and actually finished it, also followed up on the feedback that you're still getting after the launch, etc. So what we think most organizations really need to take from agile practices and lean is starting by limiting the number of things you're trying to do, and that will lead to a bunch of good things. Many developers don't necessarily understand how deep they are in the situations before they see it. So for example, in Swarmia, we have this view that covers the last year of work your team has been doing. And you can see kind of on the left how each week is represented by one of these squares, and the amount of work is kind of indicated by the color. And you can see that oftentimes you end up working on a project for a while, but you're also multitasking on a bunch of other projects. Then you have a break for a month or two, and then you kind of get back to it, as opposed to what's shown on the right, which is pretty much how our own team, for example, sees our own data. You kind of just finish one thing at a time, then you move on to the next, and you just keep doing that. And that is going to keep your customers a lot more happy when you have something new to share with them every single week. So, and cycle time is kind of the tool for measuring this thing, and is it really happening? So if you have a process that takes a really long time to get something to production, you should objectively look at, is this the best way to do it? Can we actually move something out from this and maybe do a part of the testing automatically? Can we instrument something in production to make this more reliable, etc.? So those are actually something that I would say pretty much every organization should think about. And I feel that as agile is kind of less of a topic nowadays, and most organizations are kind of just inventing their own process, I think that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, there's a couple of good tools in those toolboxes, again, that you should probably apply in most situations. Another thing is that when we talk about development productivity, it often sounds like there's going to be a metric. And we already talked about how there's not going to be a metric for stack ranking developers, how there's not going to be one aggregate number. So how should you think about this? And one of the recommendations I have is to look at the actual work that your team is doing and basically just add a little bit of extra context on top of that, so that when you finish a user story, normally Jira doesn't really show you anything about how did it go. So what we can do, for example, at Swarmia, we can push kind of this story summary to Slack, or you can kind of look at it in the product itself. You can see things like, well, how long did it actually take? How did it compare to all the other stories we've been doing? How many people contributed to this? So did we actually collaborate? Did we spread some knowledge in the team by working on this? Did we have some days when we didn't work on this, which would suggest that we were multitasking too much? How did the scope of this feature change as we worked on it? So did we add a bunch of tasks and so on? And was there maybe something that took significantly longer than what we expected? And what was the reason for that? Is it because we didn't know that area of the code base well, or was it because we had to change something from the designs, etc.? So by having this data available in the context of every single feature, you're going to improve the quality of those discussions in your retrospectives. By default, when we go to a retrospective, we just talk about the things that are on top of our mind, and we're pretty biased. And so we often talk about things that happened very recently, rather than actually focusing on the things that seem to be the most important areas. So it's actually just a good idea to bring some more context to elevate the quality of those discussions. It doesn't take you any extra time from the team retrospective. So it's basically just something to add to the relevancy of the conversations. And finally, we already talked about balancing a little bit, but that's really the core of building software products, that you just have to keep balancing different types of priorities. One interesting way to look at this is the balance framework that was proposed by a former VP of engineering at Dropbox. And he talked about this idea of splitting the work you do to keeping the lights on, which is kind of the mandatory stuff you need to do to keep your product running, to improving existing features, building new features, or improving our team's productivity. And with this kind of categorization, you're able to identify things like, well, maybe we are actually spending 50% of our development time on keeping the lights on. And understanding that will actually help you understand why some projects tend to take a bit longer, because when you're thinking about your roadmap, you're often just thinking about as if the team was just working on the roadmap things, which is the building some new things. But the reality is that there's often a lot more, and understanding what that is actually really helpful. So this is yet another view that we have in Swarmia that helps you analyze some of these things. So for example, with the keeping the lights on work, there might be a type of task that the team keeps doing. For example, in our case, we used to have, when we originally import the customer's data, there was a bunch of pretty heavy processing that was involved with that, and it was unreliable. So we often had developers who had to kind of go in and make sure that every time we got a customer that was a bit bigger than before, we would have to go and fix that. So when you are able to identify that kind of patterns, it's also good for the developers that they are able to communicate the need for example, for some refactoring work, when they're able to say that, yes, we are actually doing this much work already. And if we just spent 2 weeks on fixing the root cause, we would not have to do it anymore. And that makes it a lot easier for them to make that case and also think about the prioritization in a healthy way. So with all of these metrics, with the types of work, it's always a balancing act. And the best thing you can do is give your teams kind of good infrastructure and a good culture that allows you to have these conversations about what is the right balance. There is no right one answer to it, but if you have a team that's able to talk about it based on and backing their arguments with kind of good data and actual insight, then you're going to be doing pretty good in the long run. And that's all I had about the 7 ways to go wrong with engineering productivity measures. And I think we have time for some questions. And we have Pinia sharing some of the questions with us. And the first one is, how would you go about convincing a skeptical dev team to start using engineering metrics in their daily work? Well, that's indeed, it's natural for a dev team to be skeptical about these kind of things. We talked in the beginning that most of the previous approaches have been a bit scary and often misused in all kinds of ways. So first of all, acknowledging that is a good starting point. Then I think it's good to start from the why and kind of as an organization, how important it is for us to be successful, and also maybe just talking about kind of the nature of what scaling does for a software organization. Because the thing is that if you have a small company that's really static, the goals are the same, the environment's the same, the people are the same, people will kind of figure out all of these things without necessarily having a lot of tooling around measuring development productivity. But when you're growing and these things are changing, and many of the developers just started in the team, they will need all the help they can get in kind of improving this. So just talking about the reasoning there. And then finally, I think addressing head on the arguments on kind of what kind of metrics are we looking at, etc. So for example, we intentionally left out all of those Git analytics type metrics and stuff that looks like it's used for stack ranking developers, because that is like most of those metrics can and will be used in a harmful way. All right, then Stefan has a question about how would you go about the DORA space metrics in an environment in which you deliver software on premise? That's a good question. And I mean, this kind of shows that many of these metrics have some sort of a background in some kind of philosophy. And for example, DORA metrics are the result of the State of the DevOps report, which is about production infrastructure and like this infrastructure automation movement. And that is really about just deploying software continuously to production. And the reality is that that's not all of the software that gets built. We have embedded software, we have mobile software, and we have on-prem software, and probably a bunch of other examples too that don't fit this model perfectly. But I think it helps if you think about it the way I kind of summarized DORA metrics, which is like, how do we know that we are shipping as quickly as we can, and while making sure that we're not breaking everything at the same time. And in terms of on-prem software and mobile software, there is a cost in the release. So, for example, what most companies do with mobile software is releasing once every 2 weeks or something like that, which is kind of a good, healthy balance. And I think similarly, what you want to do is you want to avoid, for example, dynamic that would push out the releases. So if your, for example, branching strategy is such that you kind of have to wait for every single feature to be ready, that will lead to your releases being pushed out. So if you're able to get to a regular cadence, whether it's 1 week, every 2 weeks, whatever, and you have systems in place to hide features from the UI using feature gates, etc., like that's already a pretty good system. And then you have this kind of regular cadence that allows you to ship to customers, and presumably your main branch should be always kind of green in a way that you can get that out if you wanted, etc. So that's maybe how I would like to start thinking about it, but there's definitely a lot more in that area. All right, then we have a question. So sounds counterintuitive to ask this question, but for most organizations, they don't have a clear answer to the why part of measuring development productivity. What is a standardized approach to framing why measuring development productivity matters? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the way to think about it is that you want to improve. So you want to start by bringing in some transparency to these topics, and then it's easier to see if you're actually improving it. And if you think about any bigger company that's been doing kind of these agile transformations or whatever, they are pretty difficult and dangerous projects in a way, because you kind of bring totally new ways of working, and then you have no idea how the teams are actually doing. And as a result, it's actually pretty easy to, well, it's always going to have some problems, and any problems are going to be attributed to that transformation. So like, it's not easy to see, are we moving to the right direction? Did we take some good steps, etc.? So if an organization has a good visibility to the development productivity, it is just a lot easier to think about improving it. And I think that's kind of the gist of it. So we're trying to get to continuous improvement, but the problem is that indeed there's ways to go wrong with it, etc. So we need to address these reasons also proactively. Then there's a question about, is this tool primarily for the team lead? How actually it integrates into the dev process? The team is looking into it together on a regular basis on the retro, or team lead provides the insights from time to time. So one of the things we kind of, when we started working on Swarmia, we started interviewing a bunch of software companies, and we came up with a set of product principles. So things that we want to see in our product. And one of the principles was that we need to be able to provide value for every single part of the software development organization. So not just developers, not just VPs, but everyone. And team leads are one of the most important users of Swarmia. And that is because usually they are the people in those teams who are most interested in driving improvement. And it's totally fine if the primary use case for some teams is that the team lead brings it up in a retrospective, and then you have a conversation about it as a team. And that's actually pretty normal. What we do in addition to that is we, for example, the Slack integrations help the developers stay on top of what's happening on a daily basis. also helping them to adopt any new practices that you might have wanted to adopt as a team. We also have the visibility for the VP level on what are we investing in, etc. So we try to cover all of these different kind of use cases for these different audiences. But retrospectives and also the one-on-ones between engineering team leads and their supervisors are definitely one of the most important parts of the process. Then we have a question about supporting GitLab in addition to GitHub. And actually, there's two questions about that. So yes, we are planning to support GitLab as well. The thing is that this is a very new product type, or category, and there's a lot we need to figure out in how to think about the quality metrics, how to think about these flow of work metrics and so on. And in order to be able to iterate as quickly as possible, we've chosen to focus on GitHub in the initial pace. But as you can see, we're starting to have a pretty comprehensive product that covers these different areas. So supporting GitLab is quite naturally going to be part of our roadmap in the future. Unfortunately, no exact timeline to give you just yet. All right, that was all of the open questions we had. Did we have anything else? And there is one more about Azure DevOps and ClickUp. Well, so looks like there's indeed lots of interest from all the different platforms, and indeed all of these are things we've heard. So the same story about Azure DevOps, but GitLab is going to be first, and with ClickUp, yes, it is definitely there, but GitHub Issues is going to be first. So we're definitely interested in supporting all of these tools, and we need to support kind of whatever processes the teams are using. So we kind of want to keep the bar very high in a sense that we actually support different ways of using these tools. So there's a little bit of work for us there, but we'll get there. All right. I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for joining. It was great. We had so many good questions. Hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me at any point on Twitter, or kind of just reach out to us and fill the getting started form to talk to one of our product specialists. Thank you very much and have a good day.